20.
20.
Yeah. Oh, no, I just remember. Yeah.
And if I'm gone already.
Yeah, no, you're on the
I'm
clock.
not mad at you.
Of,
I like people when people walk out of my service. No one has a benefit.
I know. You can use it.
Okay, well, welcome today to our new unit, How Art Transforms Our Faith. We are so lucky to have Dr. Taylor Worley here. He teaches right now at Wheaton College, but before this, he was just down the road at Trinity, so he knows our area. He drove today from Chicago, so he did not run the marathon this morning, but some people are. And we'll be thinking about them and praying for them as they do. They'll be done by the time we start church. But it's exciting to have him here, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say. So, Taylor?
Yeah, thank you. It's so wonderful to be with you this morning. Thank you so much for the invitation, the leadership here. And I have driven past this church many times and thought, I need to get inside there and see this beautiful church. So it's great. We get to walk through the large sanctuary this morning. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk about art in the church. Yes, whenever I'm ready to go, like at any point, I'm happy to do that. So I'm so appreciative of Maddie giving me the invitation. So I'll just, we have our title here, and let me see if this has. Okay, there we go. All right. So I have a renewed urgency around the place of art in our lives. I'm wondering, what do we do when, as a society and a culture, we've sacrificed our sense of wonder? Maybe our lives and maybe our world become less human, less humane. That's what I'm concerned about. That's sort of the urgency that prompts me to want to convene these conversations and have discussion with folks. I'm aware that the arts provide us worlds unto themselves of imagination and fields and realms of exploration for our hearts and our minds and our souls. And I'm thinking now, we were just talking about this a minute ago, about the place that contemplation can play in our experience of artworks. So this is a little bit of the background and kind of where I'm coming from and what I'm interested in doing. And you might be asking yourself, why is, what's the source of all this urgency? Maybe you saw, let's see if the clicker, okay. A recent article in The Atlantic by the NYU psychologist Jonathan Haidt. The title is catching, right? Why the past 10 years of American life have been uniquely stupid. So if you haven't seen that, I recommend it with trepidation. But he said it's not a phase, and his sort of conclusion or his claim is that if we do not make major changes soon, then our institutions, our political system, and our society may collapse when the next major pandemic or war or financial meltdown or constitutional crisis happens. He's responding to the fact that as a society and a culture, we've lost the ability to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to trust each other long enough to hear each other's perspective. This is concerning to me, and I'm really interested in how the arts, especially things like modern and contemporary art maybe even the difficult and challenging artworks that we find in the modern wing of our museum, how can they help with this problem? That's what I'm wondering about. So I get some inspiration for this in.
What is that building that's blowing up?
Oh yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. This is actually I had to steal it. This is the image that they use for the article. So it is a classical depiction of the Tower of Babel, and it looks like it's digitally eroding. So the pixels are flying all over the place. So yeah, I couldn't resist. I just thought, oh, that's an interesting image. So if you look at the article online, they commissioned an artist to do that. So, but to this question of what are we going to do about the problem? I actually receive some inspiration in an adult education course a few years ago. So I'm hoping to pass it on. At my church in the city, we had a adult ed course on this book by the Duke New Testament scholar Doug Campbell. It's called Paul, an Apostle's Journey. And I do recommend books like this. This is a short one from a New Testament scholar. They usually write, big, thick ones, that we can use as doorstops. But when they write short things like this, it's sort of a biography of the Apostle Paul, which apparently in their academic guild, they don't usually get away with doing this sort of thing. So they like to play in this realm. So this is the book that sort of plays with some ideas. And one of the ideas that it entertains that really caught my attention was this question of why does Paul the Apostle, as we read in the book of Acts and track with his, adventures and misadventures throughout the Mediterranean world, why does he take a turn west? So we know that, we know a few things about the Apostle Paul. I mean, he describes himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews in the letter to the church in Philippi, right? He was on the dean's list at Rabbi Seminary. He was very ardent and fervent in his faith to the point of even contributing in the persecution of early Christians. How does this guy end up in Europe? I think it's a question. I think it's a really live question. He tells us, that the gospel is for the Jew first and then for the Gentile. That's kind of his modus operandi. That's kind of his approach. When he goes into a city, he finds the synagogue, finds the Jews, shares the gospel with them, and if they receive it, great, let's do something about that. If they don't, he moves on to the Gentiles. So, why does he go to a place where there's so few Jews? There's a much higher concentration of Jews, people that, on his own reckoning would be more responsive or more ready to hear the good news about Jesus in the Middle East, in places like Asia Minor.
He had a dream that said, don't go that way, go the other way.
Exactly. He was called in a dream. God interrupted his plans. He was headed in one direction, and surprise, surprise, the Macedonian man says, come over here. I know you weren't looking to take a trip into Macedonia and Greece and explore Europe, but maybe God's got other things in store. So, addressing that question in this text really got me thinking about what kinds of formation is happening in the Apostle Paul's life. I mean, you have this guy who's like, this sort of public intellectual in his own tradition. I mean, he's so studied. He would be so useful in a Jewish context, being sent to a Gentile context. What does that mean for him? How does he conduct himself? What does he do when he shows up and things aren't as straightforward as they would be in his native culture, around his own people, right? So I kind of want to look at a couple examples of that with you over the next couple weeks. I want to think about, how does Paul conduct himself in the secular city, or in the in the Gentile or the pagan city? What does he do with what does he do with himself? What's happening to him? As hopefully a kind of insight, or maybe some inspiration for how we can navigate this new terrain that we find ourselves in. So let's talk about three things over the next 3 weeks: faith, hope, and love. I think these were, when Paul didn't know what to do, when Paul didn't know how to, how the mission was going to go forward in such a hostile environment, I think he just had to fall back on what Christ was forming in him, these virtues of faith, hope, and love. So I'm going to take one of those for the next few weeks. Today we're going to take faith and see if we can't explore how Paul becomes a person of good faith in a hostile place, in a difficult setting. as a way to think about how we can engage the arts. Okay? So let's look at Paul in Athens. So I've got some visuals for you there, just to remind us. I mean, Athens is a pretty imposing place, right? Paul might not have planned this. Paul might not have expected to find himself here, right, staring at the Parthenon. And yet he does. So as our historian Luke records for us, I'm just going to have to start using this thing. Okay. In Acts 17, verse 16, Luke tells us that now, while Paul was waiting for his companions in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. We've probably read this text. We're probably familiar with Paul's experience in Athens to some degree. But if we think about it from a kind of cultural or kind of sociological lens, Paul has spent his entire life up until meeting Jesus trying to become the most dutiful Hebrew he can. And in his imagination, the great sin of his forefathers from the time of the Old Testament was running after foreign gods, was sharing the unique allegiance that they owed to Yahweh with the gods of other lands, of other peoples. And now he finds himself in a cosmopolitan center that not only has universities and think tanks and lots of, you throw a rock and you'll hit a philosopher. He also finds himself in a city full of idols, full of shrines and temples. In the Greco-Roman world, you have, actually a pretty sophisticated, layered structure religiously. You have the 12 high gods of Mount Olympus, that we could probably name, maybe in their Greek and their Latin names. And then you have the sort of the local sports team god, right? Each city has their patron deity, right? Athens' patron deity is Athena, right? And so that the culture and the texture and the character of that place is really formed around that particular deity and the one that's honored above the rest in the city. But then in the household, you have all sorts of little gods. It's a place thick with religion. But from Paul's perspective, it's all the wrong religion. And Luke tells us that he's provoked. I mean, this is actually a pretty guttural, visceral response that Paul has. He's sort of repulsed and disgusted by all this idolatry. I mean, he's spent his whole life trying to be a good Hebrew boy and not get interested, not get infatuated with other deities, other people's gods. And now he's surrounded by them, right? So what does he do? The Luke tells us, verses 17 and 18, so he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. I think that's interesting. I think Paul's disgusted by the city, and yet he makes himself available to the city. He spends time. He invests, not just in the places where he thinks he might gain something with the synagogue, but in places where he knows he's going to be outnumbered by his detractors. In conversations he's likely not going to win, right? He reasons patiently. He spends time. And over time, he gets a reputation as just being a really interesting fellow. Like, who is this guy? Like, he actually talks to us. He actually engages with our ideas. And he's got his own ideas. And he's been doing it long enough that he actually gets an audience. We might, it's also called Mars Hill. Here's a picture of it. You have this hill here where you can You can take the steps and go up. Now, we often think of the Mars Hill setting as like, I don't know, the Philosophers Club or the Debate Society or something like that. But it's actually not the case. In his biography, see here we have another New Testament scholar doing a biography of Paul, playing with this. Apparently you're not supposed to mix the Pauline corpus, like all his letters, with the book of Acts. Seems like a natural thing to do in my mind, but apparently don't let them do that in New Testament studies. But anyways, some people have tried to get away with it, N.T. Wright being one. So he wants to make the correction that actually it's not a philosophers club. It's not a debate society. It's actually a court of sorts. The Mars Hill was where the town elders, like the city council persons, the councilmen, obviously in this case, gathered to debate the matters of the city. So when they invite Paul in, they're not thinking about, okay, well, how do we engage with these ideas? They're thinking about the civic issues related to it. They're thinking about, well, how do we continue to manage and look after and steward our great city, where we have a shrine for every god. This guy's talking about some other God. He's talking about Jesus of Nazareth. What does that mean? Paul's in a dangerous moment, as N.T. Wright tells us, because he's being called before the city council. Their concern is, do we need to find like a new, we're going to have to rezone some properties here or something. We're going to have to move some stuff around. Like, how are we going to make space for another God? We got one for every single one, but this guy comes talking about a new God, right? So Paul's on the spot here. And what does he do? Here's how he addresses the leaders of the city of Athens. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Now, for years, I've read this part of the story, with my tongue in my cheek, like, oh, here's Paul and his sarcasm. How can the Hebrew of Hebrews tell these idolatrous, elitist Athenians, how can he commend them for being so religious? How can he endorse their religiosity? How can Paul do that? But we don't actually have any reason to take Paul here as being sarcastic. And if not, we've sort of got to take him here at face value. So what is this Hebrew of Hebrews doing here in Athens? Commending them for their earnest attempts to account for every God. I think he's actually praising them. I think he's actually encouraging them. I think he's actually telling them there's some good to what they're doing. And he wants to meet their efforts with even better news. What Paul's referring to here is, archaeologists have found, he's referring to the altar to the agnostos theos, the agnostic God, the unknown God. This is what it would have looked like. Now, it may be surprising to us that Paul uses their philosophers and their poets in his address. He quotes them so confidently. It really makes me think he might have read all that secular literature. I don't know. Yeah. Kind of embarrassing. But Paul has spent time with their ideas. He has spent time with their poets. So he can talk to them about their own cultural heritage. And in good faith, commend their efforts, try to meet those efforts with the rest of the truth. I find this kind of shocking. To the city and was disgusted by it and was provoked in his spirit. Paul is acting here in good faith. I think Paul believes that maybe, just maybe, the living God of his heritage got to Athens before he did. Maybe, just maybe. That's not a good move for this guy. When you don't know what to do, when you find yourself in hostile territory, maybe it's good to slow down and revert to those things like faith, hope, and love. And when he does, what we see Paul doing is he has to hold his nose at times. Maybe he has to grin and bear it. But he does demonstrate tolerance for a city that his grandmother would be very disappointed to find him in, right? He invests in time getting to know these people beyond just his initial read. He spends time patiently reasoning with them, and then he makes and asks a judicious question to the town elders. He asks the question, and I have a sense of your history. Your history is Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Story, good faith. He can pose that question. He's earned the right to pose that question. So it occurs to me that we're all not probably walking in the sandals of the Apostle Paul. And we're not facing epic moments like he was in the first generation of Jesus' witnesses. But is there anything that we can learn? Is there anything that we can take away from his posture? Not from his theology is wonderful. His understanding of the Old Testament, brilliant. But is there anything we can take away from his posture? How he conducts himself? How he operates before he opens his mouth? This is what I'm really curious about. What is his relationship to the past, the history of Athens? Here he's operating in good faith. What would it look like for us to try and do the same? So I love this quote from the fantastic thinker James Baldwin. It says, "History is not the past. It is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." Now, from a prophetic voice like James Baldwin, that is resounding. But I recognize that we live in a time and in a place where, as a society, we have all kinds of nostalgia. We have as much nostalgia as we want. We're very nostalgic as a country, as a people. Getting the history right, maybe we're a little more reticent to do that. So I want to think about how the strange world of contemporary art can be a space for engaging with this question of history. And how do we act in good faith in the time and the place in which we find ourselves? So if art is going to transform our faith, it might be around this issue of how we relate to the past. What kind of posture we take to it. So let me give you some examples. You may not be surprised to know that the world of contemporary art, the wild and woolly world of contemporary art, is very taken with the question of history. It is very open to exploring matters of history. And so I'll give you a couple examples here. No, the slides and the television are not failing you. This blurry image that you see here is actually a painting. I would venture to say that this painting is representative of the most technically proficient, the most masterful painter living today. This, his name is Gerhard Richter. He's a German artist. This was painted in 1965, I believe. It's a family photo. You can see that it's blurry. It looks like a photograph that's, had some wear and tear, but it's actually painted on a canvas. He has taken that blurry photographic image and rendered it perfectly in paint. He can do this. He's actually masterful in a few different painting styles. But what does it mean for someone to take a blurry photograph and render it in paint? I mean, it's a painstaking process, right? I mean, to perfectly render a blurry photo like that on a canvas, I mean, it must take hours and hours of effort and perfecting your style. Question, please.
What will be the significance of that as to thinking about Helmut Durer in the painting of the rat?
And Durer?
Yeah, Durer.
I don't know. I mean, they're both German artists, and that's interesting. But I'm not sure. I mean, here, the question of history is focused very tightly around a family photo. So when Gerhard Richter is thinking about history, he's thinking in terms of his own personal history. And that becomes a little more difficult as his nationality and culture comes into play. So this is a painting called Uncle Rudy, which is blurry like the last one. This is Richter's mother's brother, who is dressed there in, the Nazi army coat with his Nazi army hat. So the blurriness of the photo that's now rendered in paint is kind of representative of a very problematic connection to his own family and cultural history. Whew, kind of heavy stuff.
The amount of work and everything that goes in to do this, just the craftsmanship.
Certainly.
Well, how does that, I just don't get the connection between the amount of craftsmanship to the genius of feeling about his personal history and anything like that. It's still a question of just prestigious craftsmanship.
Yeah. I think maybe he's suggesting that these issues of family and culture bound up in a difficult, to say the least, history, right? The history of national cultural failure and atrocity, right? Maybe can't be found, maybe are so deep, maybe even like an old blurry photograph, they're lost to us. And we've got to start over. We shouldn't be surprised to see German artists. Here's another German artist. This is Anselm, 1944, right as the war's coming to its terrible ends. This is if you're ever in St. Louis, this is at the St. Louis Art Museum. This is called Burning Rods. This is a massive canvas. It would take up like the whole back wall here. And it's, as you can hopefully tell, it's painted with rust and lead and metal and dirt and all the debris and the detritus of a landscape scarred by mechanized warfare. You can see the layers of lead falling off. Like, I don't know how they get these things to even hang on the wall. They're so heavy. You can imagine a painting made with metal and lead. I don't even know how that works, right? But as someone growing up in the post-war generation, Kiefer's asking many of the same questions that Gerhard Richter's asking. These German examples are like very poignant, right? So we have a painting, an enormous painting, feet and feet, tall and wide, that you don't want to get too close to because it feels like it might fall on you and crush you. Replacing all those beautiful landscapes of the Northern Renaissance, all those beautiful history paintings of Europe that we all like take trips to see in the museums. Now this is the only landscape that Kiefer can paint. Here he has one of his sculptures. Here we have the Book of History with wings reaching out from it. This is from a big exhibition called Heaven and Earth. But the wings in the book are made of lead. They're not going to fly again. You can't hold it. It's too heavy to handle, and it's toxic even, right? Contemporary artists are asking these questions of how do we reckon with our past? How do we engage with our own history? What kind of posture should we take to what has happened? And I want to show you another example that we should spend a lot more time on in the time that we have left. A Chicago-based artist named Carrie James Marshall. Marshall taught for many years at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He lives about a 45-minute drive from where we are right now in the Bronzeville neighborhood of South Chicago. And he is the most important, in my opinion, American painter living today. He's masterful, just as masterful as Gerhard Richter. He creates monumental canvases as well. And we're going to look at a few of these carefully. What you notice about his painting is it's very, again, like Richter, technically proficient, precise, accurate. But in the rendering of his central figure here, this is an untitled work from 2009. And it is kind of funny that he's doing a paint by number thing here. But rendering of his central figure, the blackness of her skin is the most obvious thing in the portrait. It's inescapable. And so Marshall talks about what he's doing when he's painting black figures in his hands. He says what you're trying to create is a certain kind of indispensable presence where your position in the narrative is not contingent on whether someone likes you or somebody knows you or somebody's a friend or somebody's being generous to you, but you want a presence in the narrative of Western art that's not negotiable, that's undeniable. Carrie James Marshall makes paintings for his little nieces and nephews so that when they go to the art museum, the folks with the dark skin like them are not just on the margins or in the background of those historic paintings, but they're foregrounded. And their blackness is completely unavoidable. It's the most obvious thing about the picture. So let's look at a few of these. And here he gets his start. He read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and that completely changed his painting approach. He had to paint differently after reading that text. So this is a portrait of an artist as a shadow of himself. This is the first time that he painted a completely opaque figure. So this is the earliest painting of that style, and he's never left it. If anything, he's only gotten a darker, inkier, deeper black. This is called distyle, and as you can see, it's a barbershop, right? A place of familiarity and comfort in the black community for black men. And here we have a few of them represented, but the title, distyle, is reminiscent of de Stijl, the early 20th century modern art movement. That's just named it's Dutch. It means the style, right? Here, Carrie James Marshall is exploring, well, how do we come up with a style all our own? How can I invent a style that's both reflective of my community, but also expressive and exciting and inviting? What he does is he plays with the history of painting. So here, this subtle reference to an early 20th century art movement is representative of something called Afrofuturism. And I won't spend a lot of time on this like artistic theory or artistic movement, other than to say that Afrofuturism is an attempt to recover histories of counterfutures. It's a fantastic movement that takes into consideration the past that has been, and also the past that would have been possible if things hadn't gone the way they did. So Carrie James Marshall shows us that in his approach to painting by engaging with the Western. So here we have another setting of comfort and community in the black experience. This is called School of Beauty, School of Culture, and it is a hair salon populated as it's a meeting place for women in the black community, and the vibrancy and the richness of that experience is expressed here in paint. But what is Carrie James Marshall doing? He's also referencing historic works from the Western canon. This is Velázquez Las Meninas, where the artist is painting himself in the mirror, just as Carrie James Marshall has done here. There he is taking a photo of the scene so he can go back to his studio and paint it. He's saying, I know the canon. I know how to paint like a Western painter. I know this culture. I've taken it in, I've embraced it, and now I can operate from within it and do something that's reflective and representative of my experience and the experience of my community. Now, you may not see another somewhat subtle art historical reference here, but I'll show it to you. This is a famous painting by Hans Holbein called The Ambassadors, which looks like a normal, stately portrait painting, except for the enormous skull at the bottom of the painting that you can't see this. You have to look at the skull from a different perspective than you look at the portrait, right? So this is a famous proto-modern painting from the 17th century by Hans Holbein, and Carrie James Marshall does his own version of that. But instead of a scary, spooky skull, in this beauty shop populated by all African American women, right, there's a specter of some other presence that, in this case, is drawing the attention of the little girl. It's the specter of Aurora, the Disney princess from Sleeping Beauty. Can you see her there? She's actually rendered with glitter. And the little kids are kind of around her. So even in sanctuary spaces like the beauty shop, there can still be a haunting of the majority culture. I'm not even going to much of it here about hair and all sorts of things, but I'm not going to get into that. These are just quick examples to show you kind of what Carrie James Marshall is playing at. These canvases are big and exciting, and it's the kind of painting that's very hard to show on a television in a classroom miles away from the art museum. Marshall is making paintings that you have to stand in the presence of, that you have to look at, that you have to experience. This is called In My Mother's House There Are Many Mansions. One of the things that Marshall has done in his painting style is to try and find a place for the black couple, for the black man and the black woman to be at peace. So this is a Garden of Eden scene. here with the proto-couple there resting underneath the trees. It's not the easiest image to look at. It's not the easiest image to read, certainly. But to me, it's a surprising example of the depth of a place where the building blocks of the black family that have been a talking point in political conversations for decades at this point, have been the subject of public policy and scrutiny from all, can just be pictured in their own way in a setting that's their own. Marshall said sometimes people look at his figures and they think they're, they can't read from the appearance. I mean, they're rendered in this inky black. They don't really map onto our experience very easily. He said sometimes people think of them as like, off-putting or standoffish or, kind of difficult to reach. And he says they're not about, the figures are not looking to be seen. They're just looking to be. They're just looking to experience their own place in the world. We're going to wrap up our time here in just a moment. Thank you for letting me show you the vision of Carrie James Marshall, an artist who's technically proficient in all these different styles of painting. There's an amazing retrospective of his work in Chicago about 6 years ago that I got to see, and it was every major style of modern painting represented. But what I love is these paintings are not for me. They're not for me to find a place in them, or for me to feel comfortable around, or for me to identify with. And in that way, they're really beautiful and wonderful and really poignant. Carrie James Marshall has said, in good faith, maybe the history of the art museum, maybe the history of the way we've painted our culture and our society for so long isn't over. Maybe there's room for even my completely opaque, completely black, unavoidable figures to find a place in that same visual story. In Athens, Paul's question is, can we trade one vision of our history for another? Could it be the case that the unknown God that you are saving a shrine for and holding out the possibility that just maybe there's some God out there that we don't know about, can we trade that version of history for, here's the answers, here's the God you've been looking for? In the case of Carrie James Marshall's work, I think we're invited to ask the question, can we look past a difficult one? Can we even face it? Can it be redeemed? Can we come to value an artistic and creative vision like Carrie James Marshall's as part of the canon, as part of the best of the best? He's operating in good faith. I like to put, he has this very kind of grandfatherly demeanor there. He's operating in good faith. He loves painting in these ways. He just wants to paint himself and his own family, his own experience into the story and make it bigger and richer and fuller. Okay, let me pause there. I've done a lot of talking. What questions do you have? What are you curious about? What has been, gone over too quickly? Yeah.
Do I remember the story correctly, or Athens was the city St. Paul was chased out of, right?
Well, there's so many. There.
He actually had to run out of
I'd have to look, but I think there was like a calm, polite resolution to the town hall meeting, So I think They heard from Paul and they were like, oh, okay, we're good. So your God doesn't need a temple? Great. Because we're going to have to do all this rezoning and it was going to be a mess. So they're like, we'll hear about these strange things that you're saying later.
I can't help thinking that what Paul was proposing to the people of Athens, that got him removed from Athens,
Mm-hmm.
whenever it was done, I don't remember, and bringing up the types of issues that this modern artist is doing, could with some communities get the same action?
Oh, certainly.
Am I drawing a conclusion that doesn't fit, or does it?
No, I think it does fit. I agree. I think often Kerry James Marshall, his paintings are so different than the norm in the art museum, but so in their own way, worlds into themselves, and self-confident and exuberant in their own ways, and not needing approval or needing like endorsement from. I think he's demonstrated his proficiency with all the different styles of Western painting, and now he can play with it. And maybe that playfulness can be a little offensive sometimes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But his work is, it seems to me, his work is specifically generated for us, for us to have an awakening. What is the connection with what Paul saw there? That wasn't going to create any awakening in him about what the people of Athens had experienced their past to get to the way they were.
Yeah. So I do think Paul's being formed. I do think things are happening to Paul. I think, and as we're going to move into 2 other cities, we're going to go to Philippi with Paul, and we're going to go to Corinth with Paul in the next weeks.
Is he going to develop a greater tolerance for their idea of having multiple gods because of the experience that he's going to see around him?
No. I think he's going to have a greater appreciation for their fumbling and searching and questioning and looking, but I don't think he's persuaded in the end of their. Yeah.
For us, for looking at these, I think we're supposed to be developing a greater tolerance for all that has been missed by these people, or that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of tagging off what you're saying, Roy, I wonder if we could go back to the picture of the barbershop.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking and what you were saying, and I wonder if this is where you are. The invitation is to sit with the opposition.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul tends and listens to the faith that he has stepped into before he offers his own death. Right? And the invitation is that we might do the same, that we might sit even in this piece of art and wonder, how has the way I have seen not been informed by the voice that is out of the picture?
Mm.
And when I look at this picture, see if you guys think this, I see Norman Rockwell's painting of the barbershop, which is all very blunt, right? And the standing of the barber and the bend of the person in the chair is almost identical.
Mm.
If we put the Norman Rockwell side by side, the stance is different, but as we looked at the Norman Rockwell painting, did we ever miss the black face? And if we didn't, have we sat long enough with the alternative experiences of people? And so the invitation of faith is, before I'm ready to, defend my own, oughtn't I be willing to hear how someone else sees?
Mm.
Because all of us are seeking.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, am I tracking?
Oh, yes. Very well said. Very well said.
Because that's what I think Paul means, is that unlike, and Paul got into a lot of trouble with this.
Mm. Well said. Hmm. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Another thing too, just besides this is, I think with Paul went into Athens, he knew his audience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He didn't walk in there ignorant about
Mm-hmm.
Greco-Roman culture. He was a Roman citizen. He knew stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help thinking, when Carl Wojtyla was the Archbishop of Krakow, he had to deal with a lot of communist authorities.
Mm-hmm.
And the story is that he had studied Marx and Engels as much
Mm.
as he studied Thomas Aquinas. He knew the men he was speaking with,
Yeah.
so he was talking to.
Yeah.
He was able to outsmart them
Mm.
because he knew them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I can't help thinking Paul was the same way. He knew people he was speaking with.
Yeah. 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 In my research, I uncovered there's over 200 quotations or references or allusions to Greco-Roman literature in Paul's corpus. So it's not always a quotation like we have in the book of Acts, where he's actually quoting their poets and philosophers, but there's allusions. That's, that gets back to my bad joke that he quotes these things so confidently. It sounds like he might have even read them. I think you're exactly right. I think he spent time, and I'm curious. Like, does he have a fascination with these? I mean, he's read them well enough to be able to say, hey, isn't it the case that your poet says there's got to be a God out there who doesn't live in a temple made by hands, right? I think he's nursing a deep interest that maybe wasn't expressed until he found himself in places like Greece and Macedonia. So, yeah, certainly, maybe. We are way past time. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. Thank you so much for going along with this little ride. Yes, thank you for looking at these images with me. I look forward to doing it some more next week. Have a great Sunday. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. They do. Yeah, they do. Not enough, in my opinion, but they do have some. Yeah. I'd like them to have more. So, I mean, because he started in Chicago, there's a lot of like murals and, works that there's a question of like,